In the last two videos, we got an idea of how the offer and the acceptance come together to form the agreement as the first element required for forming a valid contract. Now, when we went through kind of the very specific requirements for both the offer and the acceptance, again, those developed at the common law. We've relaxed those a good bit under the Uniform Commercial Code, a little preview for later in this semester. But under the common law, we really are fairly precise about ensuring that those three requirements are there for the offer, looking at the corresponding three requirements for the acceptance. And one of the main rules that we discussed when we talked about when acceptance is effective is that acceptance must come before the offer is terminated. So remember, we kind of used the little analogy of a little guy in maybe a comic book with a little speech bubble. And we talked about how basically the offer kind of needs to be sort of out there, right? We want to see that offer kind of hanging out there, still valid, right? Still an effective offer that's kind of hanging out there, and the acceptance has to come while that offer is outstanding. But if something happens to terminate that offer, an acceptance can no longer be made. Any attempt at that point to make an acceptance of the original offer is actually going to be treated as a brand new offer. So this video, we're going to look at how offers terminate, and that'll kind of bring all of those offer and acceptance rules, I think, together for you. Now, I do have sort of limited whiteboard space here, so I've got everything down that we need for termination of offers. But one thing that I do recommend, if you go to the PowerPoint slides, there's kind of a few right in a row on offer acceptance and termination of offers. I really recommend pull those slides up, just kind of flip back and forth. And I think, when you have everything sort of in front of you all at once, you'll really, really see how everything comes together and it really all fits together kind of very, very hand in hand. Um, so, but for today, we'll kind of go over what we have up here, and I'll sort of try to refer back to some of the basic rules on offer and acceptance. But again, you can sort of see everything all together in the PowerPoint, or if you've been taking notes during these videos. All right, so there's basically two major ways that an offer can terminate or come to an end. And basically, that needs to happen either through an act of the party. So there's kind of one category that is somebody takes a specific action. And again, this could be the offeror or the offeree, but there's various ways that a person involved can act and therefore cause the offer to terminate. The second possibility is termination through what we call operation of law. Now, operation of law is a phrase that's used in a lot of different contexts in the law, not just here. But basically, anytime you hear this, it just means that sort of something is going to happen legally without anybody having to do anything about it. So it's just sort of like a way of saying something's going to happen automatically after a certain amount of time, right? And that's just a function of, hey, we have a legal rule that says this happens, and nobody has to actually do anything in order to achieve that result. So we'll talk about the ways that that can happen in a moment. But first, let's take a look at the different acts of a party that can terminate an offer. And some of these, just by way of giving examples and just kind of talking about how offer and acceptance happens, we've actually already discussed a few of these, but it is important to mention them in this context to make sure that we're clear that when any of these actions happens, it has the result of terminating an offer. So first of all, let's look at what the offeror can do. Well, this one makes sense, I think. It's pretty clear. Revocation terminates an offer. So if an offeror revokes an offer, we're going to say that offer has come to an end. Sort of that speech bubble is no longer out there. Most simple example of this is what we call an express revocation, and that just, again, express in a legal context, that just means through words. And now that could be through written words, it could be through spoken words, but if we're being explicit and using our words to say, I feel like I'm having like a flashback to talking to my 2-year-old, use your words, right? But if we're using our words and not just our conduct, our words mean that we're doing something expressly. Okay. So as a very, very easy example, if I write you a letter and make you an offer to sell you my house for $100,000, and then the very next day I write you a letter and say, hey, never mind, I'm revoking my offer. I've sold the house to someone else. Okay. At that point, I've revoked the offer. Same thing in a conversation. Now, a revocation, right? It could happen, it could happen immediately after an offer is made. It could happen days later. I mean, whenever it happens, it doesn't really matter. But it's very clear that an express revocation in words, whether you're saying I revoke or hey, never mind, I take it back, right? You can use a variety of words to do it, but if you're making it clear that the offer is no longer on the table, the offeror has the power to do that. And that goes back to that common law saying that we keep going back to over and over again. The offeror is the master of the offer, and that's the same as with revocation. Now, keep in mind, this is again, this timing rule with our acceptance rules. This is why the timing of these things is so important, because keep in mind, right, once an offer has been accepted, we now have a contract, right? That is not something that either party is able to just revoke and say, never mind. Once you've entered that valid contract, you're legally bound to the terms of that contract. So that's what's so important. That goes back to what we said with acceptance, well, really with offer and acceptance, right? The offer, a true, valid, legitimate legal offer creates the power of acceptance in the offeree. And that's why that power of acceptance is so significant. Because once acceptance happens, we have a contract, an offer can now no longer be revoked. But as long as it's just a plain old offer and acceptance hasn't happened yet, it can be revoked at any time by the offeror. Um, Even in a situation, right? Even if I have a situation where, let's say, I promise you, like I will give you 5 days to make a decision on whether or not you want to accept my offer. I promise you I will not revoke it in that amount of time. If 3 days in, if I say, hey, never mind, I'm going to revoke, I might not be a nice person. If I'm a business person, that's a very stupid thing to do, right? You can imagine why you would really lose trust. That would harm your reputation. You're not going to have ongoing business relationships with anyone if you're, routinely promising to hold offers open and then taking that back. But from a contracts perspective, there's nothing binding about just a basic, simple promise to hold an offer open. Um, there are some ways that you can kind of get around that if you want to make that promise binding. One thing you can do is create what's called an option contract, and that's very common, especially for larger deals or situations where you may need to obtain financing. So there's going to take a period of time before you're able to accept, because you might have to like go out and see whether you can get a loan or get the financing to complete the purchase or whatever. But you have in an option contract, it's basically like usually a fairly nominal sum, or sometimes even like a down payment is made. Where let's say I may pay you, $100 or whatever, and say, look, if you will promise not to sell your house to somebody else in the next 5 days, give me 5 days to decide. Maybe let's say you've made me an offer and said, I'll sell you my house for $100,000. I say, okay, great. If you give me 5 days to decide, promise to hold that offer open at that price point on the terms that we've discussed, and you don't sell to anybody else, I'll give you $100 or whatever, just kind of to reserve that option to purchase. Now, right, we do have that offer, right? What you're giving me is your promise to hold the offer open, but because I've given you consideration in exchange for that, we now have a binding a contract. So it is possible to do that, but if you haven't created an option contract and it's just a basic offer, it can be revoked at any time prior to acceptance. Another thing to keep in mind, and this is something that's important to be aware of, but I don't ever recommend relying on it. Revocations can occur. You can have what's called an implied revocation, which is where revocation occurs through conduct. If you had, for example, let's say, well, here, I'll tell you how I always do this in class. So if I've got a classroom full of people I'll make an offer to one student in the class, and we'll say our student is Amanda. Okay, so I make an offer to Amanda and say, hey, Amanda, I'll sell you, my phone or whatever for $50. Okay, so Amanda says, I'll think about it. Let me decide later. And I say, okay, that's fine. That's perfectly fine. Take all the time you need. Take till the end of class, whatever. It's fine. And then right there, immediately, right in front of the entire class, I turn over here to Carl and I say, Carl, would you like to buy my phone for $50? And of course, I was, hint, hint, nudge, nudge, like say yes. And so then Carl says yes. And so I say, okay, great, sold. So what I have done here, right, I never said to Amanda, hey, never mind, or hey, I'm revoking, I'm going to sell to somebody else. But she just watched me sell the phone over here to Carl for the $50, right? So what I've done is I've taken action that's obviously inconsistent with selling the phone to Amanda, and I've done that in her presence. So she clearly knows what I have done. That now functions as a revocation. So she cannot come back and say, wait, Ms. Dove, I accept, because my revocation happened before she accepted, right? My action that's inconsistent with holding the offer open has already taken place. I've sold the phone. That's effectively revoking the offer. Amanda now cannot accept. The problem with this is that the rule is the action has to be known to the offeree. So if we had a situation, let's say, where Amanda steps out of the classroom because she's going to go down the hall or whatever and get a drink from the vending machine. I now sell the phone over here to Carl. Amanda comes running back into the classroom and says, Ms. Dove, I don't know what I'm thinking. Like, obviously, I want to accept your offer. That's a really great deal on the phone. I'll never get one anywhere else for $50. I accept. Well, I'm in big trouble now because I just entered into a binding contract to sell my phone to Carl over here, but I did not ever effectively revoke my offer to Amanda, right? I sold it to Carl, but she wasn't in the room and she did not see that happen. So it was not an effective revocation. That means she accepted my offer before the offer terminated. I have now entered into a binding contract with two different people to sell my one phone. So no matter what at this point, I am going to be breaching a contract with one of those two, and I may be liable for damages. Now this is a used, it is a used phone. It's, fairly maybe a year old or something at this point, but it's a decent phone, right? I'm a big Android person. If you're an iPhone person, I'm sorry, but I'm a big Android person. This is my Google Pixel. It's like my favorite phone ever. But let's say, for example, that I choose to go ahead and give the phone to Carl. Amanda now wants to file a lawsuit against me. If she has to get on eBay and to buy a cell phone just like this, same condition, same quality, same model and everything else, if she has to spend $100 to get a phone that is comparable to this phone, she may be able to ask for damages of at least $50, right? Because she had a commitment for me to sell my phone for 50 bucks. She now had to spend an additional $50 to get the phone from somewhere else. So I'd be looking at least $50 in damages, kind of just depending on what the general market price is of a phone like this in this condition, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So again, right, it is possible to revoke an offer through this implied method. I don't ever recommend it. If you are in a situation where you've made an offer and you need to revoke it, you should revoke it expressly, and you should do so in writing to make sure that you have evidence that you did revoke an offer. Just be very, very careful about that. And obviously, if acceptance has already happened, don't attempt to revoke at that point because now it's looking like you may be trying to almost like preemptively breach the contract at that point. So do not, be very careful about that. Be careful about your timing. Okay. Oh, one other thing to note on this, the other timing rule that we had when we looked at acceptance was the mailbox rule. Remember that we said that when your acceptance is actually put in the mail is when it becomes effective. Revocations through the mail are not actually effective until they're received by the offeree. So for mailed offers and mailed acceptances, that's especially where you need to be very careful when you're dealing with the mailbox rule. And we can walk through some examples of that on, in our one of our face-to-face kinds of discussions, and really kind of, I can use the right whiteboard and we can kind of write out a whole example when we do that, and look at how that mailbox rule interacts when you're dealing with acceptance offers and acceptances, and possible attempts to revoke offers. So we can walk through some examples in a face-to-face situation, but it's very important for sure to understand the difference between mailing an acceptance versus mailing a revocation, and know how to apply that rule if you're given a little scenario. All right. There are two acts that the offeree can take that will terminate an offer. The first one is very straightforward, and that's a rejection.